Hello, everyone, and welcome to an all-new episode of Asked and Answered, our little advice column show with our dear friend Erin Lowry, aka Broke Millennial, where, as the title suggests, you ask and we answer. What's so hard to understand about that? I love just the innate hostility of the name of the show.
This is what happens when I get put on the spot for a title.
Yes, this was an Erin Lowry joint.
And I'm nothing if not direct.
Exactly. My favorite, I'm going to go on a tiny tangent here and just say that if you've never texted with Erin Lowry, get ready to be talked to about a fun evening between friends, like you're being called into a meeting with HR. We're talking periods at the end of sentences. Everything is capitalized. Nary a lol in sight.
Listen, I've worked really hard on giving you exclamation points and emojis.
But I know, and I appreciate the effort, although I do understand that they are very much out of character for you when you send like 15 emojis to illustrate your enthusiasm. But yes, asked and answered. What else is there to say? And as always, this series is brought to you by our dear friends at advisor.com. Today, we're actually going to be talking about relationships of all kinds, and something that my husband and I have been doing together for years to help improve our finances and plan for our long-term goals has been working together with a financial advisor. At TFD, we work with and endorse advisor.com because not only are they a lot more affordable as an option for people who are looking to get into having a financial advisor, but aren't necessarily already hugely wealthy. But they also operate on a flat fee model, which we really support. It's very transparent. It helps ensure that the advisors are working for their clients and not for commissions. And it just makes, I think, the process so much more accessible and also easy to budget for because you know what it's going to be every year. Like I said, I've been working with a financial advisor for a long time. I really love it. It's changed my life. If you've ever been curious, at the link in our description, you can set up a free call with one of their planners and just kind of talk to them, learn more about the process, ask your questions. And for being a member of the TFD community, you get an exclusive discount on your first year. Again, just use the link in our description and check out advisor.com. We love them. Okay, so as mentioned in that authentic, off-the-cuff, thoughtful advertisement, today we're talking about relationships. That could mean spouse, that could mean family, that could mean friends, all of the nitty gritty and what happens when money and love mix. A toxic brew.
Can be.
What is your number one piece of financial relationship advice, Erin?
Don't loan money, gift money. So if somebody asks you, whether it's friend, family member, person that you're dating, spouse, depending on how you set up your money, asks for a loan, you should mentally reframe it as a gift. And it's great to set up terms of the loan. It's great to optimistically hope that you will be repaid. But it's really important for your mental health for you to think of this as money I can afford never to see again, and that I am mentally, emotionally positioning this as a gift. And if I get repaid, wonderful. And if I don't, it won't ruin my relationship.
Okay, we're actually going to shake things up here and start our first relationship question, not with a romantic relationship, but with the oft-forgotten platonic relationship where money often comes into play. This person writes, "My best friend and I have grown apart in the past few years, and I have a hard time thinking that it's not financial. She and I grew up together in a similar economic bracket, public school, hand-me-downs, etc. Even through college and in our 20s, things were very similar for us. We work in different industries, but neither was super highly paid. Just the cliche two girls figuring things out in the big city, LOL. But in the past few years, I've gotten engaged to a wonderful man who also happens to be a big law attorney. I've changed industries to the private sector where I nearly doubled my salary. I've bought a home. Meanwhile, my friend is still in a roommate situation. She's single on the apps, barely putting away money into savings each month. I try to go out of my way to compensate for this imbalance, and I genuinely don't mind paying for a lot of things or doing stuff that is according to her budget, but I still feel a lingering sense of resentment and distance from her that totally breaks my heart. What should I do?"
I love this question, not the dynamic.
I love this dynamic.
I love that this has happened. No, I love this question because it is something that so many of us are going to experience in some way, whether it is with family of origin or with friends or both. The problem is there's no simple solve. The only way to really be able to get through this and navigate it is to have a lot of open and honest dialogue and conversation with your loved one. The problem is this is a combination of a lot of very uncomfortable topics. So most people just tend to avoid, and then tend to avoid to the point of no longer having the relationship in their life. So if this is a really meaningful friendship to you, which it sounds like it is, the first thing that I would really start with is addressing the problem. And that is, I love you so much, and you know that our friendship means a lot to me, but I have to be honest, I feel like there's been a little bit of distance in the last few years. And I'm not entirely sure why it's there. And maybe it's because my life has changed a lot in that time. And I just want to know how that makes you feel. You could just be really open-ended about it. But the other thing that I want to point out is you mentioned that you compensate a lot for the fact that you out-earn your friend. And it sounds like not only do you out-earn, but you're married to somebody who also financially provides a nice life. So the combination of the two creates a very different dynamic. Have you ever asked your friend how she feels about that? And I ask because, one, it can create resentment for you over the years that you're going to keep paying for everything. But two, it might not feel good for her. And it's very kind and generous of you to offer that, but not everybody receives that well. And so it's really important to ask if that is something that your friend wants. And I also love that you mentioned in it that you like to do things that are within her budget. I don't know how that plays out in your relationship dynamic, but it is really important to make sure that you are doing things that accommodates your friend. And whether it's your friend is suggesting it, but also making sure that your friend is not stretching her budget to try to come up and meet you at a place that would feel good to you, and she is aware of that. But just trying to have an open, honest dialogue about this at some point. And it might not go well the first time. This could be a long-term conversation that needs to get had. The other really sad reality of all of this is that sometimes relationships do not survive a change in socioeconomic status. And that also, unfortunately, ties to family of origin. Sometimes those relationships will be strained for the rest of your life. And there's no simple solve to any of this because money is tied into so much of our lives and how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive other people, resentment, feeling like somebody had it lucky or somebody just, fell into a situation or made decisions that you don't agree with. And that's usually a reframe in somebody's mind that's not necessarily fair or even true. But if it is a really valuable relationship to you, keep coming back to this idea of having open, honest conversation, but also making sure that you're not making your friend feel uncomfortable by overcompensating for the fact that you know that you have a lot more money than she does. I know that was very long-winded.
No. I think that's all valid. And I think your last point is really important, which is that, I think it's two things, right? We're conflating, I think, the relationship part of it and the money part of it. Like you mentioned, she's still single and on the apps. I know you probably don't mean it that way. It sounds a little derogatory. For the money part, to your point, I in my early 20s, I, by complete happenstance, fell into a social group that included billionaires with a B. Well, the children of billionaires. They certainly weren't self-made billionaires, but people who were incredibly wealthy. And I was very much not at that time. I was still really, really struggling financially. And there is literally nothing they could have done that would have made it not a nuclear reactor for my mental health. It was so bad for my mental health on every level. I actually think it delayed a lot of my maturing on several fronts for a long time because the truth is, like you said, yes, there definitely can be a level of overcoming that. But I think that still operates within a framework that you're still somewhat in a similar playing field. When one person is not earning much money, living with a roommate, all of these other things, and you are earning vastly more than them and married to a big law attorney who likely earns multiple six figures a year, and you own a home and all of these other things, you're in a completely different ballpark socioeconomically. It is a very rare pairing where that doesn't really tax the other person's mental health because no matter how much they're compensating for it, you know that they're compensating. And it's very difficult for there's a lot of levels of, relatability, shared experiences, shared perspectives that kind of get eroded by that. And I think for a long time, having been the person who was a really, who was a low earner hanging out with all these very wealthy people, it really, I realized at a certain point that unless you can totally just sort of gray rocket emotionally and not even perceive it in that way, which demands a huge level of emotional maturity and intelligence, there are always going to be ways in which it makes you question yourself, doubt yourself, feel insecure, feel inadequate, feel like a drain. And that is not something that you could ever necessarily adjust for or fix. It's just not. It's just not. And that is part of the reason why people tend to self-select for people who are somewhat close to their socioeconomic bracket. That's how these things work. The other thing is the relationship thing. I don't think this is necessarily your case, but it is often the case that when two people are single for a long time and one of them gets into a long-term relationship, they sort of go into relationship mode. You know, most couples kind of start to self-select for other couples. They start to orient themselves around couples things. I can't relate to that, obviously, being in a couple, but I can relate to it on the children front. I don't have children, don't want them. My friends that have children, some of them very great about making space in their lives for people around them who don't have children. A lot of them, not at all. You basically lose those people entirely and they orient their entire lives around their children and their other friends who have children. I would really check in with yourself and say, like, am I through unconscious ways hyper-orienting myself towards relationships, toward my partner, toward other people in relationships? Because that's just often what naturally happens. I sense a little bit of pity for your friend in the way that this question was posed, especially in talking about her living situation, her romantic status. I would unpack that and ask yourself, is that maybe something that she's feeling from you?
I also want to piggyback on the point about bringing your relationship into that dynamic with your friend. Other ways to think about whether or not it's infiltrating it is if your friend wants to have a party and you like automatically bring your husband or automatically ask, or maybe that was not the intention of the party. Like just kind of remembering that you can do things separately, not implying that you're someone who is perhaps borderline codependent with your spouse. But I do think that becomes a frustration for people who are single, is that their couple friends just automatically assume that an invite is for the two of them and not just for the individual person who was invited. And that even something like a party is carte blanche to just bring your spouse when that wasn't necessarily the vibe. So that's also just another way to be aware. And for all of us who are in couple relationships and have single friends, which you should, again, diversity of friendship is good and healthy.
Also, I'm going to make hella inferences here, but given that you were both working jobs that paid not a lot of money, and you're both college educated, I'm going to make some inferences about the kinds of jobs that you were working and the sort of career paths that you were on, often quite value-driven, often more service-oriented. You mentioned the fact that you went to the private sector and doubled your salary, meaning you were working in some sort of public service job before this, or public sector job. That in and of itself, I think, is a huge fork in the road for people who had always kind of two friends who had always been on a similar path. Also, and I know hashtag not all big law attorneys, but a lot of big law attorneys, I would say, are not oriented towards a lot of those values that we just sort of alluded to. And I can imagine if, like, let's say I am, maybe she works in the nonprofit sector, right? Like that's a similar kind of sector to where, because you mentioned you guys were on a similar path, earning similar amounts of money. And then my friend was working in a government job. And then in the span of a few short years, she went private sector, doubled her salary, and married a big law attorney. I think there's a lot at play. I'm seeing a lot of pieces on the board. Do you know what I'm saying? And I think moving up in socioeconomic status rarely comes with just money. Rarely comes with just money. I'm imagining you're at a lot of dinner parties with a lot of big law attorneys now, and they're big law attorney spouses because a lot of them tend to marry each other. I've been to those dinner parties. I'm the friend in this scenario. I don't know if I'm trying to go to those. I'm kidding. No, some lawyers are great, but like, to be honest, it is a very different life path. And a lot of the people who choose that life path, again, some of them do amazing work, but a lot of them, and a lot of attorneys, like a lot of my lawyer friends, I speak as if I have so many, I have a few, and they will be the first to tell you that like often moving away from the big law path was like the most important thing they ever did, because it is a very corporate, very financially driven, very not values driven profession in a lot of cases. So I also think, look at our values. Have our values changed? Has what we prioritize in life changed? Because I don't know, I'm picking up a lot of what your friend is putting down here.
Also, a PSA for everybody watching. If you come across someone at a dinner party or any function, or it's a friend of yours who works in some version of public service, don't somewhat condescendingly go, "Oh, that's so nice. Oh, how is that?" Because let me tell you, my husband is a teacher, and the amount of times that we have been to parties where somebody finds out what he does and they work a very high paying job and there's some version of, that's so lovely. You know, I always thought about being a teacher. I always wanted to be a teacher. I thought I might be a teacher in the future. Just keep it to yourself. If you have something nice to say, that's great, but if it's going to sound condescending, be real careful.
Damn. Now I'm like, have I ever said anything like
You have
that?
not.
I have
You
not.
have not.
Also, my mom is also a teacher. So I'm very like, I love meeting teachers. It feels like, I don't know. And also it's nice to see a man in the profession. That I do love.
Yeah. There's just something about when somebody who has a really high paying job makes a comment about thinking that they wanted to be a teacher, but they're not. It just never reads right, is all I'm going to say.
No, that's fair. That's fair. Although I will say her husband is just a very teacher-like person, even outside of the classroom. Like if you go over to their house to watch a football game, for example, he'll print out little sheets that have information that you should know about this football game to help people like myself who are less familiar stay informed and engaged. And that's another values thing, right? Is like that just shows a lot about like the type of values that you bring not just to your work, but also to your life. And I think going back to the question, if you and your friend always had a lot of those shared values and shared ways of approaching the world, have yours radically changed?
Yeah, it's always good to be introspective about that. And also it's okay if things have changed for you. I feel like we've been gunning hard at the question asker during this, but also just it's okay to move up in socioeconomic brackets. It's okay for things to change over your life. Unfortunately, though, the reality is sometimes relationships then also change.
That's true. That's true. Okay, we're going to do another hashtag story time. I am the oldest of 4 siblings and was recently voluntold by my mother that I will be the executor of her estate. Our father passed during COVID and my mother is in declining health, which means that this responsibility is something I have to take very seriously, even though I don't want it, hence being voluntold. I mostly don't want it because my siblings are ... complicated ... And this position of authority is already creating resentment and fracturing. The estate we stand to inherit is sizable. I haven't dug into the details yet, but definitely 7 figures in invested assets, multiple properties, cash, etc. And while my middle brother is extremely financially successful, the 2 younger ones are a bit of a failure to launch situation. This is made more complicated by the fact that my youngest sister has struggled over the years with addiction, and while she's currently sober for nearly a year, that means that her finances are an absolute disaster zone. I guess my question is, how do I prepare for this task, and how can I manage the emotional and mental side of this with my siblings? Not to be dramatic, but they are already making my life very difficult, and my mother is still living independently, so we're still at least a few years off. I told my husband the other day I feel like I have to pre-grieve her because when she's actually passed, I'll be so overwhelmed with my greedy and messy siblings that I won't even have time to just be sad. I guess I'm just really anxious about this, and any advice is appreciated.
You can outsource this. Like that is
asked and answered indeed.
No, I do not mean that at all flippantly. That sounds like a very complicated situation. As somebody who recently went through updating my whole estate plan and having to go through a lot of thoughts about like who would be my executor, who would, and by mine I mean our, but who would handle certain things. It's also important to know that you can hire people to be in positions of perhaps being a trustee. So if your sister, who perhaps your mother has decreed in the will that your sister does not get unfettered access to the finances that she would be receiving in the will, then perhaps it's not you who is the person between her and that money. Perhaps there is a financial advisor that she is going to be speaking with in order to gain access to that money so that you are not in the position of telling your sister no, that there is a third-party individual. So particularly if it's a sizable estate, that's definitely something to consider, is outsourcing part of it so that you are not making the hard choices about your siblings. You also should have a conversation with your mom while she is still with you to be able to talk about what does she want. Does she want it just equal distribution? Everybody gets their fair share. It's dead even and they just have access to it. Or does she want some sort of guardrails around it for different siblings in different circumstances? Or does she want people who has slightly less than others to receive more of the estate? You know, equal isn't always fair. So it is important to be having these conversations while your mom is still here so you can be doing what she wants done as opposed to what you think is best to be done.
I agree with all of that. My mom was in this exact situation. Also the eldest daughter, as I like to say, the unpaid interns of the world.
Both of us.
Shout out to us. She was in this situation. It was a nightmare with her siblings, and it's not fun. And to your point, yes, you can hire an intermediary, but I don't think that will prevent a lot of the Durham and Strang amongst the group, because they'll know that you put that intermediary in there, and they will often try to either work around the person that's put in there, play to your emotions, be resentful of you for having done that. It's very difficult for the person who is put in this position to escape some kind of resentment. There's often a dynamic that plays out in families, especially larger families, where especially eldest siblings, especially eldest daughters, are almost punished for being responsible, are almost punished for making good decisions or being in a position where they're now tasked with authority or they have some sway over a situation. There's often this feeling of like, well, you have your stuff together. You can deal with this. You can, and people who are maybe less together, have less of a stable situation, I think often feel entitled to act out in certain ways, to not treat people very well, to lash out and express their resentments. Also, if they've struggled with addiction, this is something where maybe, we've had addiction in our family, and there can be a situation where, a person can, let's just say, make things quite difficult for the family for a very long period of time, and then feel a sense of resentment when that is not immediately sort of forgotten, or it is still being taken into account that that's a possibility. I understand that, and this is, very vaguely, this is an extended family thing, but I know that for certain family members, one of the most difficult parts of having another family member who struggled with addiction is having to hold some boundaries around things like finances, access to things for a long time after that person was no longer in active addiction, which I think is one of the most under-discussed aspects of it, is how it affects the family unit. But I don't know if you're in Al-Anon or a program like that, but I would highly recommend visiting a spell to a program that specifically deals with loved ones recovering from addiction or in active addiction, because a lot of what will be discussed is sort of how to manage those relationships after the fact, because that throws an entirely new dimension into things, and can make the family relationship just incredibly strained. It would be nice if everyone was treating you really fairly about this, but it's also extremely common, and I guess to some extent human, that they're not. I would also maybe talk to a therapist and just unpack a lot of this stuff, because I don't know what they're saying or doing to you, but if it gets to a place where they're being really unkind to you, harmful to you, violating your boundaries, harassing you, speaking in a way that's, not acceptable, like, you have every right to be like, no thanks, bud, you don't get access to me to do this. And I've, again, extended family, but there have been people who've had to put up those no contact things for a while during these kind of stressful times, because just because people are blood relatives doesn't mean they get to treat you any way they want to and still have access to you. So take care of yourself is my advice.
Another consideration, depending on whether you think it would be mentally healthy for everyone, is a discussion about who is receiving what before your mother is deceased, assuming that she is mentally able to have this conversation and not going to be manipulated into changing her will. But if there's a surprise coming, particularly if it's not just split 25% to each child, that might be harder to deal with after the fact, as opposed to having conversations with people previously, so that there is an expectation of, this is why this decision was made, this is who is getting what. And it might reduce some of the anger and animosity for you in the room when the will is being read, because there's been a little bit of time for people to process, on top of grieving now a death in addition to that.
Totally. I'm also picking up a sense through some of this phrasing that mom is kind of outsourcing a lot of these hostilities to you to deal with, which is also not uncommon. And that's also something that's I think a therapist can help unpack, is this tendency in families to sort of abdicate the duty of having to have these tough conversations, and sort of putting it on someone else to absorb that. But I will tell you, just again, from, personal experience, seeing up close, like, it is very difficult to be a sibling who's in the position of holding boundaries, saying no to certain things, or dealing with things fairly. And you will often be punished, ostracized, not treated well as a result for doing that. And just remember that that is not your fault, and not something that you also have to just accept.
And also, in the conversation of what people are getting, you probably are entitled, well, I will say you are entitled to an executor fee, whatever the fee is for this estate. You might want to have a conversation ahead of time with your siblings about the fact that you would be getting a little bit extra because you're doing all of this work. I would also outline how much it is a huge lift to settle someone's estate, which is why the executor earns a fee. But also maybe some of that fee can be used to creating some of these support systems that Chelsea has referenced for perhaps whether it's hiring a trustee, although that should come out of the estate, but hiring a therapist for you, figuring out how to process this, especially with you feeling like you almost have to pre-grieve, and figuring out how to set up these boundaries in a healthy way. Perhaps in addition to whatever you would be receiving from the estate, the fee could be an additional way to just kind of cover the costs of something that's being presumably a little bit forced upon you.
One of my friend's fathers was the executor of his parents' estate, and his brother tried to sue him for taking his executor fee and basically accused him of embezzling money from the estate. And they ended up I think they settled out of court, but they ended up in a extremely hostile legal battle, and I think still don't speak to this day.
Yeah. So sometimes it's nice to just explain upfront before it's even an event that these things are going to happen.
I'll never forget my lawyer when I very first started working with him at the very formation of TFD, when we were all putting together the operating agreement, because I have partners for context. And I'll never forget, he said to me, just make sure to make this as ironclad as possible, because no matter how much you like each other, trust each other, know each other, I've seen it all. And when money enters the picture, I'm not saying it will happen to you, but I'm saying it can happen, and you never know when it's going to happen. When money enters the picture, people lose their minds, and they become ruthless with each other. And I've seen behavior exhibited that you would have never, ever thought would have happened. But money, especially if two people are in very different financial situations, and for example, let's say are expected to split things 50-50, the person who has a lot less could be very likely to feel very not okay about that and act accordingly. Or the person with a lot more could try to use that leverage to extort even more from the other person.
Yeah.
Money makes people crazy. How do you deal with people not acknowledging their economic privilege?
That's a great question. I mean, you could bring up that it's bothering you. I mean, I guess it depends on the circumstances. I would love more context. I feel like we just got so much information and backstory on the last two. I think where I struggle is if people make flippant retorts around things, and it's not just economic privilege sometimes. Like, there's so many versions of privilege, right? And even something like partner privilege or what have you, that people will make comments that, I'm a fairly blunt person. I tend to just say like, well, because you're in a privileged situation. Or I try to acknowledge for myself as well, because I have a lot of privilege personally, that if I'm able to do something and there's a contextual reason to bring it up, say like, but I'm very fortunate that I'm able to do this, or I'm privileged and I'm able to be in this position. But privilege is a very loaded word these days, and I think that we're going to see it continue to become a more loaded word, and that people like to mentally perceive themselves as having earned a lot of what they have. And a certain degree of privilege doesn't necessarily negate that somebody has put in a lot of hard work to achieve certain things in their lives as well. So it's an important thing to also balance acknowledging when there has been a marriage of both luck, privilege, and hard work, and when something is just like straight up, they only have the advantage because they're privileged.
I also think we have to parse out when people are just not talking about it super actively versus gaslighting. Our March video essay is all about generational wealth and kind of how it sort of like insidiously works its way through our lives and impacts so many different outcomes. And I think people don't need to walk around with like a name tag that gives all of their stats. Although I wish they would kind of. But I do think we have to really separate out what is actively being misleading or disingenuous. Like, for example, let's say you and your friends are in the place in your lives where you might want to buy a home. And one of your friends who just bought a home received a substantial down payment from their parents, loan or not, received 6 figures plus from their parents for a down payment, and actively declined to disclose that when they talk about their process of buying a home. I consider that, especially between friends, a form of gaslighting. I consider that to be almost duplicitous in a way, because you are very clearly creating a false expectation in the context of your friendship around what is possible, around how you are each sort of navigating life, relating to finances. And, I have asked my friends, I'm obviously very transparent about my finances, but when I've asked friends about certain things financially, generally speaking, because I self-select for friends who are also transparent, they will disclose a lot of advantages, things that happen, whatever. And again, I don't think people need to walk around saying it, but if they are, especially if you are in a relationship with this person of any kind and they are actively omitting it, I find that to be very dishonest. And I really don't like that. And I will also say, it also depends on how people present themselves. But I do think there's something there's some sort of ethical violation in actively presenting yourself as something other than being very wealthy. And I think that especially in our era, I think social media is also a big part of this, because not only are we now suddenly having sort of access to other people's lives in a way that we normally wouldn't, and seeing them displayed in a way that we normally wouldn't outside of our close social groups, I think there's also a very high expectation of relatability that puts pressure on people to seem less, to seem like they have less than they do. Which is why it's always so funny to me when like celebrities will go out of their way to like film in like the ugliest corner of their house. And it's like, babe, we know you live in a mega mansion. The jig is up. Like, you don't have to pretend to be relatable. But I think the question to ask yourself is, are they just not talking about it at every turn, or are they actively denying, downplaying, and or misrepresenting it? That's the line for me.
The only pushback I'll give on that is you should consider what you're entitled to know about a certain person's life. Where I agree that if they're trying to give you advice about something and their version is not at all relatable, or they're not disclosing their particular advantage in a situation, then yes, they owe you that information. But I don't think that everyone has to give all of their, I don't buy the sandwich board thing of like,
what's the sandwich board?
Well, like having like a clapboard of like, here are my sponsors, here's everything,
No.
every advantage I've had. But particularly influencers or people who are presenting themselves in a way, or somebody in your life who is presenting themselves in a way, like I, for instance, with student loans. I feel like as a millennial, there's almost this presumed debt that we all have. Everybody assumes that you have student loans. And so it's just easy not to correct people if you don't. Like, people are just going to kind of assume you have them. I've been very forthright from the jump that my parents helped pay for 50% of my college education. And then I went to a college where I had scholarship. I graduated debt-free. That was a huge part of my narrative, even with a title or a moniker like Broke Millennial being associated with my brand. It was broke in other ways very early in my career. But I did marry somebody that had over $50,000 of student loans, so it got me in the end. But point being, if you're giving advice to folks about how to live a financial life, and then you are like me, sitting on absolutely no student loan debt, that's pretty relevant information for your audience members to know. And so I disclosed that very early and was very forthright about it. I do think that there are people who day to day who are not living as influencers or not living as financial educators, or insert term here, who for a multitude of reasons feel uncomfortable disclosing that kind of privilege. If it comes out about your friend that maybe they have an economic privilege of which you were unaware, it's also an interesting question to ask why they were uncomfortable telling you. Like, I think that that's also an interesting conversation to have. But if anybody is giving you specifically or generally advice and then not disclosing an advantage that they have, that's completely unfair and also not relatable.
I think it's for your own mental health, and certainly for mine, I think it's important to just assume that when you're seeing people who have a certain level of prominence in, whether they're influencers or they're in media or they're in these industries, with rare exception, they probably do come from money, because it's very difficult to be in them without. But again, the financial aspect adds. But I will say the other thing is, I do think this is the one subject on which we diverge the most, probably, because I disagree. I think you owe everyone transparency. But more importantly, I think it's like, you don't need to be upset that a random man at the coffee shop is not disclosing his finances. But again, I think if you're friends with someone, if someone is a member of your life, if you're choosing to have this person in your life and they're like actively hiding their finances from you, like, and I'm not saying you need to interrogate them, but again, to use the house example, if their parents gave them a down payment and they never disclosed that when celebrating their good news about buying a home, I find that to be a form of gaslighting. And I personally would not want to be in community with that person. That's my personal choice. Everyone has different standards, but I find it to be very frustrating for mental health. And I feel this way also because I think especially as we start to get older, it becomes clearer and clearer the vast differences between people for whom family is a financial burden and family is a financial privilege. And as we enter into the years where more and more of our parents are retiring and unable to work, getting sick, all of these things, the divide in even just my social group between the people who have to care for their parents and provide for them in retirement versus the people who stand to have an inheritance or whose parents are going to help them through their financial life, like we're on two different planets. Yeah. And to not acknowledge those things, I think it just really prevents true intimacy, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I think it's an interesting concept, though, to also disclose if people are financing their lives on debt. Like it's an interesting other side of this equation that if somebody is presenting as having a lot of things and you can't understand how they have that, to also acknowledge that sometimes it's debt or leverage in another way that has provided that. Because I feel like with social media, but just generally, there are so many ways in which other people's lives are very confusing in terms of what they have and what you assume their income or otherwise financial status to be.
That's true. I don't think but I think that's not privilege to me.
It's not privilege.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thought process, though, that if we're talking about transparency around things, that for some people, what you might be perceiving as them having economic privilege is actually the reality of them having debt. And that's an interesting part of the
fair.
problem.
I just think it's if it's about the ethics of disclosure, I think the ethics of disclosure bear on privilege, and not like if someone, having been the person who was driving themselves into credit card debt to live a falsely inflated life, did I owe my rich friends that truth?
Don't.
Though I wish I had told them. I wish I had. Okay. Last question. A classic. Should I get a prenup? My boyfriend's going to make a lot more money than me.
Yes, get a prenup. Not just because your partner makes more, because you don't know that for the rest of your married life, your partner will make more. Things can change. My favorite line about prenups, as someone who has a prenup, is that actually everybody has a prenup. It's just the default laws of your state. It is your choice about whether or not to read those laws, decide if you think that divorce law in your state is fair and equitable for the ecosystem that you've created. And if it's not, then you need to design a contract that feels fair and equitable for your specific relationship dynamic. So many people think that they don't have enough money to have a prenup. They're not rich enough. They're not wealthy enough. They're not going to, let's say, inherit wealth or anything like that. The number one thing that gets absolutely annihilated in a divorce are retirement accounts. So if you have a 401k or a 403b or an IRA or a SEP IRA or solo 401k or any of these things, please consider getting a prenup, at least a very basic one, particularly if you live in one of our 9 community property states where it doesn't matter what happened or who's divorcing whom for whatever reason. Things are split 50-50, often including debt. So that's the other big thing to consider is if somebody accrues debt in your marriage, often if they bring debt in, typically that is seen as theirs, but there are ways to pierce the veil. So you also want protection from debt, not just protecting your assets. So that's my stump speech.
Community property kicks in after 10 years, right?
I think it depends on the state. In California yes. Does. Thank you, Erica Jane.
Thank you, Real Housewives. We've learned that many times.
Yes.
I would like to echo all of that and add one thing. And this is my speech for all women in relationships with men. But especially, like you're describing, a woman in a relationship with a man where he's likely to earn a lot more, which is, like it or not, the average dynamic, or the more common dynamic, I should say. Not only should all women have their own private emergency fund separate from their husband that he has no access to, can't control, just in case. I like to look at probability. I like to protect myself. And although I love my husband, he's the most wonderful man. I could never picture him doing anything untoward. I don't care. I don't trust men as a group. And as a woman, things are different for me than they would be for him in many different circumstances. And you certainly never know what could ever happen in this life. As a woman, I am just naturally assuming more risks in a variety of ways and want to protect myself at a higher level and think all women should protect themselves at a higher level because nobody goes into a marriage thinking it's not going to work out. Nobody goes into a marriage thinking that something bad will happen to them or that they'll be in a dire situation. But I also say this, especially if he has more financial leverage, because although once a divorce is sort of in action, there's all kinds of rules about what people can and can't do with money. They can't cut off cards. They can't, move money, all those kind of things. In theory, that's true. In practice, people do petty and devastating stuff with joint finances all the time. If you think that a man who has vastly more money than you will not use that to mess with you greatly in a period where you are separating, divorcing, whatever the case, or things just aren't going well, you are sorely mistaken. So I personally feel that it is incumbent on all women, especially if they earn less, to have their own money where, if God forbid, let's say you're in the process of getting divorced, he drains the joint checking account or cuts off the credit cards, and you go file an injunction or something to get it turned back, whatever. Where are you going to sleep? Where are you going to go? If he changes the keys, where are you going to go? If you have to get away from him for safety reasons, do you have the ability to feed, clothe, and shelter yourself? Like, these are questions I think all women need to ask themselves, because again, let's say 90% of the time you won't need to tap into it, but God forbid you do. You do not want to have all of your money somewhere where the man can get to it. That's just my opinion.
So on that point, you avoid that becoming financial infidelity by disclosing, assuming you are in a safe and healthy relationship, that there is an existence of an emergency fund. You don't have to call it that, but you can say, I have an account. It is just mine. It is what makes me feel comfortable. You do not have to disclose why if you don't want to. If you are in an abusive relationship, then never mind. But for people who are in a healthy relationship, I do think that having a secret account veers on financial infidelity if it's not disclosed, not that you shouldn't have one. I do think it's great to have one for all of the reasons you just described. But if you get used to hiding money, that can lead to other financial secrets as well.
I don't know, man. Roe v. Wade fell. And for a lot of women in this country, if God forbid they're pregnant and don't want to be, that could be immediately a drastic expense. And you do not want to be reliant on anyone, including your own husband, giving you permission or financial ability to take care of that.
No, I'm saying have the account. I'm saying you disclose that an account exists if you're in a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
It is if they have
I guess you do.
I don't consider that financial infidelity, though, if the husband's hiding money.
I don't consider it hiding money. I consider it a woman protecting herself at all costs. You can disclose it if you want to. I don't think it's an ethical obligation to disclose it, because I think in the world that we live in, especially today, women need to protect themselves at a very high level and don't owe that explanation to anyone. I personally believe.
Second thing we're going to disagree on. If you're in a healthy relationship.
That's okay.
Just because of financial infidelity. But I want to come back to the prenup conversation and on women protecting themselves. Because two big advantages of the prenup. One, if you already have it in place, if you've gone through the process, then if things change drastically in your marriage, particularly maybe you were the higher earner, but then things shift later in your marriage for a multitude of reasons, you could then go back and readdress the prenup by having a postnup. It is a far less awkward conversation to have a postnup when you already have a prenup. If you just out of nowhere say to your partner, I think it'd be a good idea for us to get a postnup, which is a postnuptial agreement. It's a prenup after you've said I do. Then alarm bells are going off. Somebody thinks you're about to ask for a divorce. But if instead the reality is you were an earner, maybe you were an equal earner or a higher earner, but now mom or dad got sick and you have to step out of the workforce to care for them for a period of time, or you had a child and you've decided to take a step back for a couple of years and all of a sudden you're not earning that income, that absolutely needs to be addressed in the terms of your financial situation in your marriage. And if for whatever reason you decide to step back from the workforce for a period of time to caregive, particularly, have your partner set up something called a spousal IRA. You can still have money getting contributed to your retirement in your name as long as your partner is working and earning an income like that. So if you as a household are in a financial position to be contributing to 2 retirement accounts, that's a really great way for women to also protect themselves. And a final thing on your prenup. Look for language in there such as if you are going to waive alimony, if that's something that you and your husband have decided on. Maybe your husband's family has particular prenup language that they like to use. And they're like, oh, we don't pay alimony. You'll just get a payout. If you say something like, no, it's fine. I'll waive alimony, spousal support, whatever you want to call it, because I'm working. There should be some sort of language in there like, well, if I step out of the workforce for a period of 2 years, 3 years, whatever you want to say, I am now entitled to alimony, because it's going to be far harder for you then to get a job post-divorce because you haven't been in the workforce for a period of time. So other things like that to consider if you don't necessarily want to go through a post-nup situation, then that should be accounted for in a prenup.
I always feel compelled to say that we've had a lot of divorce lawyers on the channel before who have said that post-nups are extremely muddy legally and very hard to enforce. So do keep that in mind. All the more reason to get a prenup, because post-nups you can get one, but they're very legally complicated.
And have language in there that then accounts for like if-then situation.
Right. I've been radicalized during this conversation. I actually think all women should have 2 secret bank accounts that they don't tell their husbands
Which
about.
ones? So for which and which? What are the 2?
One is just for in case of anything happening to my body that I don't want to be, especially depending on where you live. And the other one is just so he never forgets who's boss. No. And listen, you're right. You should probably tell him about it, but I just don't think you owe a man any explanation on that. We got to protect ourselves, sisters. This is the thing. You made the caveat, if you're in an abusive relationship, don't tell him that. But often, people don't reveal themselves as being abusers at the beginning of a relationship. Like,
sure.
You just never know. And I have seen multiple women in my family get really railroaded by a bad man who had a lot of money in the case of divorce. And I wish they'd each had their own little secret hideaways.
It is a complicated conversation. I think the only reason I like to bring up financial infidelity is because it is such an issue in a lot of relationships and marriages. And so to just carte blanche give advice to hide money in one area, it just becomes easy to rationalize hiding money in other areas. So if you are in a healthy long-term relationship, again, you never know what can happen. I understand that. But if you are in a healthy relationship, it is important to also have a conversation with each other about what constitutes financial infidelity. And if your partner brings up like you hiding money in any way, then there just needs to be a thought about that. Because if I found out that my husband had a secret bank account, I would be pretty upset. But I also know that my husband does have a bank account just in his name, because I have one just in my name that we both fund. And so we do both have our little stashes, and we're just aware that the other one has that. I don't know how to get to it. He doesn't know how to get to mine.
I think you should have 3 secret bank accounts.
Every time I bring it up, we're just going to add a number of secret bank accounts.
I'm second wave feminism in this, which is like, ladies, F these men, protect yourself at all costs. You can't trust any of them. And you're like, we're equal, gender parity, transparency. I'd like to get there one day. I don't think we live in that world, especially not under Trump.
I understand that. I do.
Protect yourself, queens. 4 secret. Okay, guys.
And just keep in mind, your money can be 100% separate. Just because you're married does not mean you have to have joint finances. So if that makes you feel more comfortable, that's also a reality as well.
5 secret.
All of your bank accounts are just secret.
Your entire home, the walls should all be lined with secret money. Okay, guys, thank you for joining us. We will see you back here next week on our next episode of Asked and Answered.